Not yet?
Not yet.
Okay. I'm ready. Okay. So, herzlich willkommen und good evening all around. Mein Name ist Friederike Schulte, ich bin die Leiterin des Carl-Schurz-Hauses in Freiburg und ich begrüße Sie heute Abend eben auch aus dem Freiburger Carl-Schurz-Haus zu unserem Transatlantic Tuesday. Don't say where we're actually streaming from, but tonight we have invited you to this event from, I think, 11 different locations in Germany of the various, of our partners, the various German American institutes, centers, America houses in, and I'm going to name you all, Stuttgart, Freiburg, Heidelberg, Tübingen, Leipzig, Cologne, Hamburg, Kiel, Saarbrücken, Nuremberg, and Munich. As well as by the Atlantische Akademie Kaiserslautern. It's great to work with you guys and welcome to the widespread audience from all the various cities. I just want to mention quickly that we work together regularly. And just to pick an example, it's a little longer ago, but one of my favorite ones, a little more than 2 years ago, we welcomed Joseph Stieglitz. And you can still watch his talk with Lars Feld on our Carl-Schurz-Haus YouTube channel if you like to. And today I have the honor of welcoming, if ever so briefly, because I don't want to take away from your time, Susan Glasser, Washington correspondent of The New Yorker. Welcome, Susan Glasser. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me today. Really delighted to be with all of you.
I can hear everyone clapping, actually, in my head. My colleague Renee Freudenthal will have the pleasure of moderating the conversation with Susan Glasser on her latest book, The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, which she wrote together with her husband, as you may know, who is none other than Peter Baker of the New York Times. So even if I don't know, the media or the New Republic title just a day or two ago, Donald Trump is boring now. I think it's not boring at all, but absolutely necessary and very insightful to re-examine with some hindsight what happened during the Trump presidency, what pervasive decisions were made, and especially decision makers were elected, and how US politics have been changed or have changed since. And I think so this is the best chance for all of us to do so, because you have around 60 minutes, the great expert on hand who I can say wrote the companion book to the Trump years, I would say. And I just wanted to, before I go, alert you to take advantage of the chat function, and please use it to put in your questions. We will leave time for questions at the very end, but feel free to write them into the chat as soon as you think of them, because sometimes there can be a bit of a delay with the YouTube transporting that. So with no further ado, I'm handing over across the hallway to my colleague Renee, who's sitting in our library. And Mrs. Glasser, I know you have an eye for detail. Maybe you'll see that our librarian has decorated the backdrop as an homage to the medium you write for. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you, Friederike. I will say a few words about the author and the book for people who don't know about her and it yet. Susan B. Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a wonderful weekly column on life in Washington under Trump and Biden and whoever is next, and records a weekly podcast with her colleagues, Evan Osnos and Jane Mayer. She's one of the most revered and reliably brilliant journalists working in America today. She's also a global affairs analyst for CNN. Glasser served as the top editor of several Washington publications. She co-founded the highly influential Politico magazine, went on to become its editor throughout the 2016 election cycle. She previously served as the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, which won 3 National Magazine Awards in her tenure. Before that, she worked for a decade at the Washington Post. She oversaw coverage of the impeachment of Bill Clinton, served as a reporter covering the intersection of money and politics, spent 4 years as the Post's Moscow bureau chief, and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She edited Roll Call early in her career. Her books include Kremlin Rising and The Man Who Ran Washington, which she co-wrote with Peter Baker, as Friederike just said, of the New York Times. The Divider, her latest book with Baker, here it is in print, tells the inside story of the 4 years when Donald Trump went to war on Washington, from the chaotic beginning to the violent finale. With that, thank you so much for being here, Susan Glasser.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. I love the New Yorker backdrop in the library. And, I think it's really a terrific moment, actually, to be having this conversation, because we wrote The Divider as a book of history, our first effort to, kind of understand the 4 years of Trump in the White House. But with Trump now running again, seeking to come back to the White House, it might be as much prologue as it is history. And, it certainly remains a very urgent and pressing story to anyone who wants to understand, this ongoing crisis in American democracy.
Mm. And I think it's fair to point out that there's already a library of books about Donald Trump and his cartoonishly chaotic turn at being president. I think yours might be the most closely to which we might come to a definite account of these years. It had on me a curious effect, I think. I chiefly remembered how much I had already forgotten about those years. From Trump trying to buy Greenland, to musing about nuking a new tropical storm, to the infamous Helsinki meeting, of course. I had blocked out so much already because there was just so much stuff. And so I was wondering, because of the whirlwind of 2020 and the pandemic, and then of January 6th, overshadowing everything that came before as well, when you spend your time researching this book and writing it, did you ever feel that like you might get a spiritual concussion from revisiting these years?
Well, thank you. That is a good question. A lot of people have asked us versions of that. It is sort of a dark place indeed if you spend too much time contemplating, sort of this sort of chaotic mind that came to dominate all of us over the course of a 4-year period. But we felt that it was very important. The reason that this book is different than all the other books is that we thought it was really important to actually make an effort to do an authoritative account of all 4 years of Trump in the White House, in part because we know that there's always more to learn, and that it's very important to establish as full of a historical record as possible, especially because the story of Trump and the presidency is a story about challenging and systematically, attacking and looking for the weaknesses in American institutions. So trying to understand how he carried out that campaign struck us as a very important act of, almost taking testimony, if you will. But there is just so much, craziness and mayhem, and he's the only politician I can ever recall whose strategy again and again and again for dealing with a scandal or a crisis is simply to create another scandal or another crisis and hope that you forget about the first one. And it turns out that kind of works. The Trump fatigue factor, the Trump overload factor, I've actually personally always thought that really contributed to Trump's defeat and Biden's victory in 2020 was simply that people were exhausted by Donald Trump. They were worn out by the spectacle. They were worn out by the scandals and the chaos and the constant show. And I think they wanted a president who wasn't, in their head 24 hours a day.
Yeah. You've already had such a long and illustrious career as a journalist, also as a kind of Washington insider, I would say. And I thought a lot about this study in contrast, maybe, that this book and the previous book you wrote with Peter Baker offer to readers. The book before that is The Man Who Ran Washington. I've briefly mentioned it. It portrays James Baker, of course, the all-efficient chief of staff, legendary Secretary of State, for a quarter of a century, basically like the power behind the throne of Republican presidents, from Ford to Bush the Younger. So I was wondering, while you were working on this book, did you go back and reflect on that old-fashioned, like respectable Washington insider type of politician? Because the man you covered next was the man who ran Washington into the ground. If you
exactly, we thought maybe we should call the book on Trump something like that. I think it's a great question. Obviously, Jim Baker remains very well known in Germany for his really crucial role in helping to midwife the reunification of Germany at the fall of the Cold War. In fact, in working on that book, I think that was probably my biggest sense of Baker's real claim to a historical legacy. I would say it actually was his extraordinary diplomacy in that period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in the really remarkably short amount of time that led up to the reunification of Germany. I think that Baker was crucial to that, even more than President Bush himself. Perhaps it was Baker who took the lead at key moments, who even pressured his own boss. So, I think he's justifiably still well known and well regarded in Germany for that period of American leadership and American diplomacy. Now, right now isn't necessarily Donald Trump. Is almost the opposite of American leadership. It's American negative leadership. And if there's one thing people will probably remember about Trump's presidency when it comes to foreign policy, it will be, his consistent preference for America's adversaries and attacks on America's allies, such as Germany, such as NATO. And, that's just simply something we've never seen before, really, is an American president who so clearly and visibly preferred America's adversaries and enemies to its allies and partners. That's a remarkable story in its own right, and should and will be the subject of many books on its own. We did make national security and foreign policy a big theme of the divider because I think it shows you how much Trump was operating against the grain of Washington and of really bipartisan foreign policy, Democratic and Republican. It's not just Jim Baker's diplomacy that he didn't resemble. It's like nothing from any president, of any of our lifetimes. And yet I will say this, there is an interesting connection. Certainly Washington no longer functions in the way that it functioned when Baker was at its height, basically, during the Reagan years in the 1980s, and then up through both of the Bushes in the 1990s. It's a kind of a dysfunctional, gridlocked place, and many of the achievements that Baker had would be very, very hard to replicate that today. However, there's also the story of the Republican Party. And in some ways, you do see the through line. In fact, we were pretty shocked, and many of the people who read our book were quite shocked and surprised to find that Baker, although he's still alive, he's 92 years old, very, very with it, in pretty good shape physically and mentally, that Baker actually voted for Donald Trump, both in 2016 and in 2020. And this is despite disagreeing with Trump. In our interviews, he told us that he thought Trump was crazy, that he was nuts, that his ideas, really went against the grain of so much of what Baker associated with being a Republican. And the party that he built, things like free trade and internationalism and working with allies in NATO, all those things were things that, Donald Trump was really on the other side of Jim Baker and most mainstream Republicans. And yet Baker voted for him. And for us, we kept asking him the same question over and over again. But I think in the end, it helps to provide a little bit of an explanation. How is it possible that Donald Trump, could come and basically take over the Republican Party and actually win the American presidency when so many people knew what he was and disagreed with him. And I think the extreme partisanship and polarization in the United States today is reflected in a man like Jim Baker, a man really of significant personal integrity, saying that he would vote for a man that he thought was crazy to be the president because at least he wasn't a Democrat. And I think that was the explanation. And, many Republicans just basically identify more as Republicans and more against Democrats right now in a way that is a very debilitating dynamic. And it does mean, by the way, that if Trump were to become the Republican nominee again, he would be a significant possible winner once again, 2024.
So where that can lead, we see in the end of your book, at the end of the first Trump presidency, the second anniversary of the storming of the Capitol has just passed in January, which you wrote about in the book, hauntingly, I think, and also in your New Yorker column just a few weeks ago, that also dealt with this ongoing chaos in Congress, where the same members who aided and abetted Trump's attempted coup now blocked the election of the new Speaker of the House for 15 rounds, for 14 of those 15 rounds, and threw Washington into deeper dysfunction. You wrote, "The insurrection is dead, long live the insurrection." Maybe the next campaign slogan for Trump. 2 days later, there was another insurrection in Brazil, where the Trump of the tropics had a futile attempt of clinging onto power. We in Germany also had something of a shake-up with a Thuringian prince some time ago. And when the report of the January 6th events had just been published, Joe Lepore wrote about it, your colleague in the New Yorker, and it made me think about how you as a journalist might have approached fitting the enormity of just this event. And I mean, if you go into the report, it's just astonishing how you fitted this into your whole narrative of 4 years of Trump. How can you make this fit? How does that work, working as a journalist?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we struggled with in doing the divider because of the incredibly, theatrical, dramatic, and awful ending of the Trump presidency. 2020 was a year of such upheaval. First with Trump's first impeachment, then with the coronavirus pandemic and the shutting down of, the global economy, essentially, the campaign itself, Trump's attack on the legitimacy of the election after he lost, culminating in this, violent attack by Americans on their own American capital at the instigation of the president. In a way, we wrote the divider as an effort not, to explain the chaotic ending of the Trump presidency by looking at what came before it. And I was really influenced by a comment that Michael Beschloss, the very distinguished American historian, made even on the afternoon of January 6th itself. He said, this insurrection was foreshadowed by every single day of the Trump presidency. And so that sort of became almost a mission statement for us. We wanted to chronicle the dramatic events at the end of the presidency, but only after building up to it and looking at the previous 4 years. For example, one little detail that really stuck with me is if you go all the way back to January of 2017 and the beginning of the Trump presidency, there's this scene in our book. It's the very first work day of the new presidency in January, and the president is having the traditional first meeting with the bipartisan leaders from Capitol Hill, from Congress, and they come to his office in the White House. And Trump is talking about the rigged election. The rigged election of 2016. Only Donald Trump would say that the election that he won was actually rigged. And he starts going off to Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic minority leader at the time, about how, well, she's from California, and didn't she know that there were thousands of dead voters who voted in California, and how, the results from there were totally suspicious and rigged. And people forget this, but how striking is it? And it's such a through line. Donald Trump, it turns out, has attacked basically every election he's ever participated in as a rigged election, in order to spare himself the potential humiliation and embarrassment of having to recognize that he lost. He even claimed, that the Emmy Awards were rigged when his television show, The Apprentice, didn't win one. That again, Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and understanding as clearly as we can who that man is and how he's operated over time, I think was very important to us in then going and looking in a very detailed way. The whole last section of the book is about, his campaign to overturn the 2020 election and how it culminated in this madness. But it's also, and I think this is important, it's a rebuttal. It's a rebuttal to those who, like Bill Barr, for example, his attorney general, who criticized Trump about the effort to overturn the election, but acted as though, they were shocked that, this terrible thing had happened. When, if you really look closely at the Trump story, there's very little surprise at all. It's still shocking, but it's not surprising.
Yeah. And as you've already mentioned, Trump is running for president again already. I think most people in Germany don't want to think too hard about that right now. I don't know about America. So far, up until a few weeks ago, he had barely left his palatial estate, Mar-a-Lago, of course, in Florida, made only headlines when he dined with an anti-Semitic rap superstar and a Holocaust denier, of course. All kinds of legal troubles are coming for him. You've written about that as well, of course. He seems to many a diminished figure, and many pundits have already been writing him off. I mean, it's already starting to shift again a little bit right now, but there were a few weeks where people were certain that this time Trump is really dead in the water. Olivia Nuzzi just wrote in New York Magazine about his sad, lonely, and last campaign, as she called it. And you yourself, I wonder, have you already written off the chances of writing the sequel, The Divider, Still Dividing? Or do you think that's still in the cards?
Well, let's say we're not planning on writing a sequel to the book. However, I would caution against writing Donald Trump off just yet. I think a lot of people made that mistake in 2015 and 2016 when he first ran for president. And, shame on us if we screw that up again. The bottom line is that Donald Trump right now is not only the front runner for the Republican nomination, but he doesn't even have any serious competition yet. And it's not yet entirely clear that someone such as Ron DeSantis, who right now appears to be the most significant potential challenger to him, will actually run. It looks as though he may, but it's not determined. And remember, DeSantis has never run a national campaign, has never run outside of Florida, and has certain liabilities as well as advantages going into it, including, by the way, Donald Trump isn't entirely wrong here, that Donald Trump is the man who made him. That, DeSantis was sort of an obscure, very far-right congressman running in the Republican primary for governor a few years ago and losing until he decided to go over the top in his support for Donald Trump. Trump endorsed him. He even ran a commercial, which I recommend to you. It's an extraordinary commercial in which he uses his infant and baby and toddler daughter to show how pro-Trump he is. He dresses the baby up in a Make America Great Again onesie. And he sits with the little girl, the toddler, and reads her a book called How to Build Trump's Border Wall. And, basically won election as governor of Florida, being the most pro-Trump guy. That was his whole campaign, was I'm the most pro-Trump guy. And so, of course, right now, Donald Trump is very angry with DeSantis and says, he'd be nobody without me. And there is a little bit of truth to that, actually. So should we write off Trump? Absolutely not. I think that would be a mistake, especially in a crowded field. You don't need to have 51% of the Republican primary electorate in order to win the nomination. You just need to have more than the other guy. And in a very divided field, Trump has a pretty intense, hardcore following of super fans who are not likely to desert him. And so, it's not a foregone conclusion that he will win the Republican nomination, not at all. But I still think that there's a little bit of an element of kind of, self-soothing among both Republicans and Democrats these days.
Yeah, definitely. So when I read the book, I tried to think of when I first heard about who Donald Trump was, because when you go through these 4 years ago, 4 years again, you realize how weird this person is and how unique in some ways, and how outlandish it was to live through this. And I could pinpoint it to almost exactly 20 years ago when I tried to catch a series finale of Ally McBeal, actually, on holiday, and The Apprentice was on the holiday resort's television. And The Apprentice was on just before the show I wanted to watch. And so I learned about this man and his "you're fired" glory and all of this projection that the media allows, of course, when you're on a reality TV show. And only years and years after that, people became acquainted all over the world with this peculiar psychology, I think, in the end. And at the very end of your book, you visit him again, of course. You've met him probably many times, but you are actually in the book, basically, because you visit this exiled Napoleon in his Rococo castle by the sea, as you call it, and sit across him. So I'm, of course, curious, how do you approach being in the same room with this kind of alien man who was president?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're right. There's the essential weirdness of Donald Trump is sometimes hard to capture and convey, but it is an important element of why this is such a weird and disturbing chapter in American history. So Peter and I interviewed Trump twice for The Divider in Mar-a-Lago after he left the White House. The first time was in April of 2021, so not that long after he left the White House. And then the second time was in November of 2021. In both cases, there was a certain, kind of sad pathos, to Trump. He did remind me of kind of a Napoleon in exile figure, but only if Napoleon was also sort of a hotel group. And he would, he's like a maitre d' offering people a Diet Coke and, would you, sit down here? Are you comfortable? At the same time, kind of ranting and raving almost to any audience that would listen, craving the adulation of the crowd. Now that the crowd is reduced to basically his paying customers at his own club. And so, there was an element of, patheticness to it. It left me with little doubt that he would seek the presidency again, that he would run again. It was always clear to me because he was otherwise just this kind of pathetic, lonely figure sitting there at Mar-a-Lago. Interestingly, over the years, a number of people, journalists included, who would go and interview Trump in the White House would come out and say, well, he's actually, in person, he's more charming than you think, or he's, at least doesn't seem as crazy. And I was prepared for that to be possible. But then I quickly realized when we met with him that was, let's just say, setting expectations very, very low. And that in truth, he's not at all charming, unless you say he wasn't like ranting and raving and screaming, like he's not the character of his campaign rallies, so he's not confrontational overtly. In fact, he's actually quite conflict averse. So he doesn't want to argue with you. What he is a rambling old man who's filled with grievance. And, the real challenge in interviewing Donald Trump is that it's very hard to get a word in edgewise. Very hard to ask a question. It's not an interview in the sense that you ask me a question, I give you an answer. You ask me another question. It just doesn't work that way with him. In fact, in the entire 3.5 hours that we spent with him over the 2 meetings, there probably was not a single sentence with a noun and a verb and a period It's just, he just sort of free associates, goes from thing to thing. And of course, our strategy was, well, we had a certain number of things we wanted to ask him about. We thought, well, he's obsessed with the 2020 election. We'll try to wait and ask him about that at the end. And of course that didn't work. He was immediately talking about the rigged election, within the first sentence, basically. So it was illuminating for anyone who's going to write about Trump. Of course, it's valuable to see him in his, natural milieu. But it's not an informative session so much as a revealing one.
That's very interesting. I think the book is, it's fair to say, almost as much about the people around Trump, the enablers, the sycophants, the lukewarm skeptics, as it is about this tempestuous billionaire at the center of things. There are, of course, generals from central casting, as Trump says, who Trump would like to behave more like Hitler's generals. There is his whole gold-plated family. There are populist provocateurs. There are cabinet members who try to rein him in. That's a big theme in the whole book, of course. But at the court of Trump, I think it's one lesson of the book, only one person is really not disposable, himself. And the book is also kind of a terrifying tale about Trump getting better at getting rid of the constraints and of the people who represent these constraints, and getting better at being president in a perverse way, I guess. So how did you reconstruct this whole evolution? I mean, it's 4 years. From this hapless toddler in chief, I think that's unfair to babies, but it's been said often, to kind of a chimpanzee with a machine gun in the end.
That's quite an image. Well, the other image that really stuck with us, to your point about Trump learning over time, is, I don't know if you remember the first Jurassic Park movie. Yes. With the dinosaurs, but had an interview for the book with a very senior U.S. national security official who spent a lot of time in the Oval Office with Trump directly. And this person made the point that you're making, that over time, Trump, in fact, had learned, how to operate the machinery of government more. And they compared Trump to the velociraptors in the first Jurassic Park movie. There's this really scary scene when the children are running away from the velociraptors, and they run into the kitchen and slam the door, and they think they're safe. And then click, you realize that the velociraptor has learned how to open the door. And it was a really chilling moment in the movie. And it was also a really chilling moment in that interview that I had, when this very senior U.S. official said Trump is a velociraptor learning to open the door. She did not mean that Trump had somehow, learned more about healthcare policy or, the logistics of foreign aid. What this person meant was that Trump is understanding how to wield the levers of power and how to get outcomes that he wanted, how to make sure that he had people surrounding him who, his main criterion was personal loyalty and willingness to carry out his orders and whims, regardless of their legality or even of their political advisability. And for that reason, were Trump to win a second term, I think it's important for people to understand it would be very, very different than the first term when he did not yet have that experience.
This whole, I might call it the shock and awe phase of the Trump presidency in the beginning, with Muslim bans and words like shithole countries and American carnage in his first speech as president, gives way, I think, in your narrative, at least atmospherically, I guess, to something more muddled after 2018, when the Democrats take back the House pretty triumphantly. Nancy Pelosi emerges as this, once again, speaker, of course, but also as his match, I think, in Washington. The Republican trifecta of power is gone. The great achievements, like the Trump tax cuts that they like to boast about, are done. There's nothing much to follow, really. The Democrats begin picking a challenger. That's not really in the book, but that's in a time period, I guess. And at the same time, Trump's freewheeling approach, you've already mentioned that, to governing, gets not only more professional in a inverted commas kind of way, but also even more frantic and erratic. I think that's in the book as well. So were you ever wondering, while you were still commenting and reporting about this period up until he lost the election, if you are still a political reporter or becoming kind of a performance art critic?
Well, I think to a certain extent, the performance art element of the presidency tended at times to overwhelm and obscure the seriousness of the very sustained threats that Trump was mounting to the institutions of American government and American democracy. And in this period, actually, after his defeat in the 2018 midterm elections, Trump actually grows, I think, more dangerous and more determined, almost as if he's saying, screw it. I kind of did what, the establishment wanted, and look where it got me. And now I'm going to do things my way. And he gets rid of, immediately after the 2018 election defeat, what does he do? The very next day, he fires his first attorney general, Jeff Sessions, who he believes, quote, betrayed him, by recusing himself from the Russia investigation and setting in motion the appointment of the special counsel, Robert Mueller, to investigate Trump. He fires Jeff Sessions. He gets rid, a month later, of John Kelly, who was the second of his 4 White House chiefs of staff, a former Marine general. Kelly was very much one of the constrainers, somebody who literally saw his job, according to our reporting, as, trying to keep Donald Trump from doing anything that too grossly violated the law. And he also has a confrontation with Jim Mattis, his first defense secretary, right after the 2018 election. And Mattis becomes the first defense secretary to quit in opposition to a policy of a president in decades. And that leaves Trump with the new acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who told the White House staff the day he was appointed and Kelly was out, well, he was just going to, quote, let Trump be Trump. And I think I would call this the kind of let Trump be Trump phase of the presidency, in which essentially, he's running roughshod even more than in the first phase of his presidency. Has fewer and fewer constraints. This is the period then that he really begins seeking to politicize even more the administration of the Justice Department, to use it as a weapon against his political enemies. He has a new Attorney General, Bill Barr, who that's his explicit mission. And Barr goes along with many of the things that Trump wants to do. Trump is seeking to use the military, not just as backdrops for his photo ops, but he's often demanding that they take actions that they felt were risky, dangerous, and escalatory, such as launching missile strikes in Iran, which was a consistent theme that he was often demanding of his advisors, and they were often pushing back against him. And so I think that in general, the story of the 4 years is the story of Trump getting rid of those who he thought would seek to hem him in. He had a notion, a very unrealistic notion, when you understand the American system, of everyone almost personally reporting to him. And one of the most telling and damning stories in the book is something that happened to John Kelly when he first became chief of staff with Donald Trump. And, very relevant to this audience, they're sitting there and Trump is mad at the Pentagon for something. And he says, why can't you effing generals be more like the German generals? And Kelly says, what do you mean? And, Trump says, like the German generals in World War II, they were totally loyal to Hitler. And Kelly says, you're crazy. First of all, that's not true. And actually they conspired and tried to knock Hitler off several times. But, more importantly, this is America. What are you crazy? And it's just this incredibly, first of all, shocking moment. It is. And I know there's a lot of crazy stuff, but it is worth just sort of taking a breath and realizing this is shocking coming from an American president. number one. Number two, it actually is revealing of his state of mind, because again and again and again, that is his lament. These are all people who Donald Trump appointed to these jobs, and yet inevitably he would sour on them and he would believe that they were not loyal to him. There was a great line, Reince Priebus, who was the first of Trump's chiefs of staff. He used to tell people, Donald Trump loves two kinds of staff. He likes the people who used to work for him and the people who will work for him. And that just sort of says it all.
Really, it does. Yeah. So when we jump ahead to 2020 and when Donald Trump, of course, collided with COVID-19, it was sometimes, at least for me, hard to think of that coincidence not as kind of an act of God or karmic payback, maybe, because the man who always needs a fight with an enemy to keep himself on the forefront found that the final boss of his presidency, if you exclude Joe Biden, was an invisible airborne virus. So this lifelong germaphobe, I think that's also important to point out, had his re-election prospects basically ruined by his feckless handling of this once in a century, at least until now in this century, pandemic. So could you have envisioned him at any point rising to the challenge and becoming this kind of wartime president, as he liked to call himself back then, against this virus, or was that always a fever dream of the commentariat?
Yeah, I'm going to go with fever dream there. Donald Trump, was almost the polar opposite of the kind of scientific approach to a public health crisis that was needed, in a situation like this. And, in many ways, the virus was the ultimate enemy for Donald Trump. It didn't care about his tweets. It couldn't be bullied, or scared. It didn't watch cable television. It just goes on its way, killing and taking advantage of human weakness and human frailties in order to, acquire strength and grow and travel. And, it was a great test of his presidency, and he failed it. And, look, those are crises clarify, right? Whether it's in a presidency or in any other workplace. And we learned, that Trump simply wasn't up to a challenge like this. And largely, of course, he was undone by his toxic narcissism, right? His self-absorption. He makes any crisis, even a global health catastrophe with enormous economic consequences, into a personal grievance. And in this case, he believed that this virus had come to deprive him of re-election and to ruin what he always called misleadingly the greatest economy in the history of the world. And so there is also this weird element of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because Trump says, oh, no, this is terrible. I'm not going to, it's going to hurt my reelection. And then he makes a set of decisions that hurt his reelection. He was given advice. One of Trump's weakness, as with many, would-be dictators and strongmen, is that he surrounded himself with sycophants and yes men, right? And one of the risks for any country that's ruled by such a leader is that their leaders don't get good information, that they don't get told no, that they don't get told unpleasant facts. However, the record is clear enough that there were at least some people, both in Trump's White House, on the National Security Council staff, and also even his campaign manager at the time. They did warn Trump both about the virus. They warned him as soon as January of 2020, what was likely to be coming. He didn't listen. He failed to take action. He had incompetent people surrounding him. And the same thing happened in February of 2020, when he was warned that the coronavirus was likely the only thing that did pose a significant threat to his reelection. He chose a course of almost magical thinking and denialism which again, to anyone who's followed Trump's career is not a surprise because magical thinking, conspiracy theories, outlandish, untrue facts, magical medical cures, all of those are things that already existed in Trump's past. And we're not a surprise to those who had followed him closely. But I think even for many Republicans, or at least Republican-leaning independents, when you start to have real people dying as a consequence of Trump's lies, when you start to have, your workplace shut down and your schools shut down, and no confidence in a president who's changing his mind every day. He's on television, peddling magic cures that turn out to be not cures at all. This is kind of over the top stuff, I think. And, he tried to make a pandemic go away through the power of his words.
Yeah. So in the acknowledgements of the book, which I found really interesting, you disclosed that you and your husband actually did not at all plan to be White House reporters again after the 2016 election. You were, I think, pretty ready to report from abroad again. And funnily enough, that's what you write, you still found yourself being a foreign correspondent, but from Trump's basically upside down Washington. Your column in those years was called Letters from Trump's Washington. Now it's called Letters from Biden's Washington, of course. It was so interesting to just follow along with what you thought every week, basically, about all this whirlwind, tsunami, tropical storm happening in your country. And now that it's a completed experience, and I try to compare and contrast what I read over the years in your columns in the New Yorker with the book I've read basically in one go after it was finished, I was wondering if you were pondering how these years and reporting on them, and you really had to digest it all for the columns, I'm pretty sure, changed you as a journalist and maybe also as a human being and as an American.
Well, thank you so much. I do think you've been a really thoughtful reader of all my work, and these questions today are reflective of that. I'm really appreciative of it. What I would say is that, a couple of things. First of all, I having been a journalist, obviously my whole career, and the vast majority of it in Washington, except for the 4 years that my husband and I spent in Moscow as bureau chiefs for the Washington Post during the first few years of Vladimir Putin's tenure. Aside from that, the Washington that we've lived in and worked in, this was and represents a profound disruption, and one that did not end on January 20th, 2021. We're living in a period of a kind of a real crisis, I think, in American democracy, when so many things that we would have thought unthinkable continue not only to be thinkable, but actually to be happening. And that's an amazing moment to be a journalist, because, we're here first and foremost to bear witness. And I do think that for me, the Trump years were kind of a return to first principles. There's a clarity to our job as journalists in the Trump era that, perhaps had been kind of lost in the shuffle. The Obama years, I kind of found them to be a more technocratic era in American government. I think there was a little bit of delusion in that, but there was a sense like we were kind of tinkering, to make things work better. Behavioral economics was all the rage. It was like, how do we nudge people to the right policy outcomes? And Obama himself, as you know, was kind of a cool, rational, level-headed, technocratic, character. And certainly you didn't have a sense that, the country was like actually on fire, and, now not a day goes by when somebody doesn't write about, are we headed towards civil war, right? And, that's just not the kind of thing that you would have thought was even conceivable in, sort of late era Obama, say, 2015. And so I think for journalists, it's a mission-driven moment. You have a president of the United States calling out, quote unquote, fake news, launching sustained attacks on what he called the enemies of the people. Well, for anyone who lived in Russia or has experience in the former Soviet Union, that immediately, was like a kick in the stomach for a journalist. We understand, enemies of the people, vrag naroda in Russian, was literally the term used, the sentence by which millions of people were sent to the Gulag and to their death in Stalin's Russia. And that's, what more reason could there possibly be to be a journalist than to, find a way to record and write this down? Let's just hope we're never going to have more extraordinary material as journalists than that. But there was an element of, sort of all certainties being exploded. And, is this really a place that we know anymore? And how do we even understand what's happening here?
As the Chinese curse goes, may you live in interesting times. So I have picked two questions from the audience for the last few minutes. And the first one from the chat is what your assessment might be of the Democrats looking ahead to the State of the Union. So what will Biden focus on, especially in light of his likely run for re-election? And what will you be looking out for as a journalist?
Yeah. Good question. Joe Biden's second State of the Union speech will be given next week on February 7th. And, I was just speaking with someone yesterday about this, who's involved, who, said the theme will be, perhaps not surprisingly to anybody, sort of Biden's efforts to do what he calls, sort of defending democracy at home and abroad. And I think that's the link that Biden will seek to establish between this extraordinary effort to mobilize an international coalition on behalf of Ukraine and to deal with the incredible challenge posed by Russia's invasion of that country almost exactly a year ago, and the ongoing crisis inside America of American democracy. I think there was a hope when Biden first came into office that maybe Republicans had just overreached so much, and January 6th was just so over the top and so shocking that the fever would burn itself out. But that's not the case. That's not what happened. Biden was wrong about that. We did not experience what you might call a reversion to normal. I think in many ways that's because you never saw a decisive repudiation of Donald Trump by the Republican Party that that created him and gave him power and legitimacy. And until the Republican Party withdraws that power and legitimacy, we still haven't really fully had the reckoning, even though Trump was defeated. So that, I think, will be the context for Biden's speech. It does appear as though he is running again. Even though he is 80 years old, he's already America's oldest president. If he were to run and win again, he would be 86 years old at the end of his second term. I think there are many people, Democrats as well as Republicans, who are very concerned about that. And yet, Biden, he spent his entire life, basically his entire adult life, pursuing the presidency, believing he should be the president. Having finally, very late in life, attained that, it's very, very hard to walk away from power. And I also think that, Biden believes that he's the guy who knows how to beat Donald Trump because he's the guy who did beat Donald Trump. And right now, that remains the big paramount goal for many, many Americans, more so than any policy goal. There's a sense that, Trump does represent something like an existential threat to American democracy. And I think Biden will capitalize on that as long as Trump remains in the running.
A second question from the audience that's quite interesting. I'm supposed to ask you what you think about how the media is handling the authoritarian turn of the GOP. She gets the impression, so the question asker, too many journalists are not really realizing the danger for US democracy.
Well, I guess I would take a little bit of issue, with that, in the sense that, this is not, 2015 anymore. We've all been through a lot by this point. And, I understand that we're all media critics now in this day and age. First of all, the media is not a monolith. And, part of our challenge, actually, I think, as a democracy, and we're seeing this in all Western democracies, including Germany, is that the fragmenting of the media means that it's very much pick your own truth, pick your own adventure, pick your own narrative. And I think that actually is probably one of the biggest challenges we face going forward. And there certainly is a part of the media in the United States that, is constantly on the democracy beat. In fact, has literally created new job categories to have people following full-time the ongoing crisis in democracy. The question is really whether and how is that message breaking through to audiences that might need to hear it. And I think it's harder and harder to do that in this very, very loud, crowded, and often polluted public space that we're all operating in.
Definitely. I think that's a very good way to end the conversation. Thank you so much for everybody who tuned in. And most of all, of course, thank you, Susan Glasser. It's really been a delight. It's been an honor to speak to you. I hope you will never have to rename the column Letter from Trump's Washington again, and that the sequel will make room for another book we all get to read. You can also purchase the book in all German bookstores. It can be gotten anywhere pretty much, and you should definitely, even though it is a bit of a ride, as Susan has acknowledged. Thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you very much for the wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Good night.